My name is Mike Simpson. I'm the Director of Infrastructure Systems and Software in the Network Services Division at Internet 2. And I just want to take a little bit of time this morning and talk about, in a little more depth than we've been able to do previously, what we now call the Arroyo architecture. So that is kind of a broad framework that is going to structure all of our automation, orchestration, and telemetry efforts over the next several years, I suspect. So I want to talk about where the word came from. What's an arroyo? The dictionary definition of an arroyo is it's a steep-sided gully formed by the action of fast-flowing water in an arid or semi-arid region like we have out here in the Southwest. That's a picture of an arroyo up at the top right. I live in Tucson. In this part of the country, we have no rain for 10 months of the year, and then we get 12 inches of rain in 8 weeks. That's our monsoon season. And the arroyos are all over the place. This is not too far away from my house. And what they do is arroyos channel that super heavy monsoon rain flow, so it doesn't just flood all over everything, because the soil out here is not porous. It would not run off, it would just flood. And so the arroyos channel all of that water into arroyos and then into streams and then into riverbeds, and just make sure, keep things from getting too exciting when we have these massive rainstorms. So as an architecture, what happened was I got very tired of saying over and over again, unified extensible framework for network service modeling, automation, orchestration, and management. And everybody got tired of listening to me say that over and over again. So I was looking for a shorter word that I could use to substitute for that. And it's metaphorically appropriate to our intentions, right? We want to provide a lot of increased visibility into our services. We want to provide increased ability to interoperate with and self-provision Internet 2 services and systems in a structured fashion. That's the Arroyo part, right? In a way that channels that energy and that activity into constructive, useful ways of activities. So Arroyo is not a project, it is a set of activities that we'll be undergoing over the next several years. So that includes implementation of vendor products, off-the-shelf products. It includes a lot of local software development at Internet 2. It'll involve enhancement of some of our existing service offerings and the creation of a number of new service offerings, as well as lots of other stuff. So that's Arroyo. And despite the fact that there's a logo in the bottom right, we just cobble that together to have something to put on a slide. Don't get too involved in that. So I wanted to walk through that architecture sort of from the bottom up and kind of how it fits together at a moderately abstract level, a little in the weeds for some of it. So at the bottom is the managed infrastructure. These are the low-level physical and virtual devices that are under configuration management. For us, in the context of NGI, right, on the optical layer, that's the Sienna 6500s and the Waveserver 5s. On the packet side, that's the Cisco 8201s and 8202s that make up the core of the NGI network. As well, now we're talking about the Juniper EX4600s that are the switches that run our out-of-band secure management network. Things at this layer are primarily physical devices, physical gear. You see different vendors, you see different control protocols for how to talk to those, right? Sometimes it's CLI, some vendors provide netcon for REST interfaces for their stuff. There's a slow rate of component evolution, right? Those Waveserver 5s that we're using, we're not likely to swap them out for something completely different on a year-to-year basis. This level of the infrastructure, this level of the architecture evolves slowly. And I characterize interaction with things at this layer as direct access or configuration per device. This is very traditional. You are logging into one device at a time and you are issuing commands to that device to configure it. The way this level of the architecture grows is through adding more hardware that we would then consider to be under management. So for instance, we've already had some early discussions about whether or not we should be treating, we have a number of SRX firewalls that are also part of the secure management network. Should we be treating those as devices that we put under configuration management as well? And there will undoubtedly be other pieces of gear that we decide to bring into this architecture over the next few years. Just to give a couple of examples of what interaction at this layer looks like. I am told that capture on the left is TL1. I can't confirm or deny that is in fact what it is. I have never done any TL1 myself, but I am told that's what that is. And on the right is just on one of our aggregation switches, one of the Cisco's. That's just a quick show interface and a BGP session query, just to show that this is, when you're interacting at this level, that's what you're doing. You're logging into specific devices. It's usually sort of command line-ish, and you're talking to one thing at a time. So then above that level, as we start to sort of build this automation and orchestration stack, the next level up is what I call the configuration management tier. So these are, for us, traditional software applications that automate and orchestrate configuration deployment and updates across the managed infrastructure. And in NGI, that's really two specific products for us right now. That's Sienna MCP, so the manage, control, and plan software from Sienna that controls the optical layer. And then the Cisco Network Services Orchestrator, NSO, that controls the packet side of NGI. At this layer, there's a mix of physical and virtualized environments. So for instance, right now, our MCP and NSO instances are running on VMs, fairly traditional VMs. The MCP, I think Sienna would be happier if we ran that on physical hardware. So there, you find a mix of physical and virtual environments, but still what I would consider to be more traditional VMs at this layer. A moderate rate of component evolution. Again, swapping out Sienna MCP for some other optical management thing is not something we're likely to do very rapidly. It's something that would take a long time to accomplish. So a modest rate of evolution at this layer. And I characterize access here as managed access, so configuration per service. So we're up a level from the individual devices. We have the opportunity to sort of initiate configuration events that stretch across multiple devices at the lower tier. And really that's where the automation kind of turns into orchestration, when you're doing one thing at a higher level that's turning into multiple actions at the lower level. Extension points at this layer are sort of, if we were to extend it, we would be adding additional management platforms. So one of the ones that's sort of in our queue for 2022 to look at is the Sienna Route Optimization Analysis, ROA software package. So that's complementary to MCP and NSO. At this layer, extending the architecture at this layer is really about deploying these off-the-shelf backend. I think of them as backend packages. Another few screenshots of what it looks like when you interact with the architecture at this layer. So top left, that's a quick screenshot of MCP managing one of the 6500s. And then the other two screenshots, the one sort of toward the middle, that's NSO showing a specific peering setup in San Jose. And then the more interesting one I find, the one on the right, that's again NSO. That's actually NSO's view of a single OESS layer 3 VPN, so a multi-point VPN, and you can see you've got 3 endpoints identified there. The neat thing here, the thing I want to point out is, again, you're configuring the VPN as a unit. You're not configuring individual endpoints. NSO is kind of doing that for you, and you're just providing the kind of source data that feeds into the modeling that then turns into the specific configuration. So a little higher layer of abstraction, a little more efficiency. If we go up another layer, now we're getting into the more abstract layer that I call the Unified API Microservices layer. So that's a cooperative software microservices that abstract and unify functional management of services delivered through the configuration management products. So what happens at this layer is we kind of smooth over those vendor differences, right? You shouldn't have to worry whether you're talking to MCP or NSO or other pieces. You should be able to make a request that turns into multiple requests to various backend systems that altogether will cooperate to provide whatever service you're asking to manage. And the characteristics at this layer, we're deploying these as containerized microservices. So we're using a Kubernetes platform to deploy these. This is where we get more into our locally developed software stack, primarily in Python 3 for us. And presenting those APIs as REST JSON APIs is a fairly standard microservice architecture these days. Moderate rate of component evolution, I would say moderate to fast. It is much easier to adjust or add an API service than it would be to add something like MCP or to switch out something like the wave servers, right? So as you go up the stack, you get a little more flexible, a little more agile, a little more able to respond quickly to things. And I say access at that level is what I call transactional access or configuration per request. So that the things that you're requesting through the API are fairly high level management actions that then break out into what needs to happen at the lower levels of the architecture. The extension points at this, again, are all about adding more of these API microservices. And so, the ones we've already got defined that we've been working with, which are kind of the foundational microservices we knew we had to write first. So for instance, the sessions microservice, that's what integrates with all of the in common IAM machinery. That's what gets you your single sign-on. That's what gets you your access tokens. That's where we sort of learn who you are, and then we can produce these bearer tokens that control what you're allowed to do in all of the API calls. Similarly, there's a policy service that we're working on. Again, that's a unified access control service, so that any particular action that you want to accomplish, we're going to compare what we know about you with what you're trying to do, and the API call will either allow it or disallow it, or change how it responds to a request based on that interaction through the policy engine. And then the first of the kind of member-facing microservices that we've started working on, we're working on an updated version of what's currently called the router proxy service. We're calling it the Looking Glass API right now. And again, very similar functionality, the ability to query into our infrastructure, into our routers, and return information in a way that is sort of secure and safe and structured as much as we can make it. Extension at this layer, again, is adding more API microservices. So, as we get into 2022, we have a whole set that we know we need to start working on. So that, the earlier in 2022, and we've actually started some work already, looking at controlling peering services through an API. We know we're going to get into cloud service provision before we get too much further through the year. We've talked about some API calls that might be useful to integrate telemetry into all of the other things that this stack is doing. And lots of opportunity there. I think we're sort of still discovering what the API is going to look like and what the useful services through that API layer are going to be. Some quick screenshots of interaction at this level in the architecture. And you can see it's starting to get more abstract. We're getting further and further away from the specific gear. Top left is just a screenshot of something called Postman. So that's an application that software developers use to develop, design, and test REST APIs. So it's just a tool that you can use to essentially fire REST queries back and forth in an automated way. And so that's just me running a couple of queries against our prototype API. Down at the bottom, that is the actual API response from one of those Looking Glass calls. So that's basically running that show LLDP neighbors command on one of the core routers. And returning output. And it's coming back as formatted JSON. All of these APIs that we're designing both take JSON and deliver JSON in return. One of the nice things about the way we're doing the API, that some of the frameworks we're using, if you look at the top right, the frameworks that we're using to develop these APIs actually, as a side effect, if you annotate your code properly, produce these open API specifications. And those are essentially specification documents that you can hand to any number of tools that can then configure themselves to use that API. You can use it to do things like generate client library bindings to your API calls, things like that. So now we're getting all the way up to the very top of the stack, what I call the tools and interfaces layer. And these are when we get to the real user-facing either CLI or GUI tools and interfaces that abstract and coordinate calls into the microservices layer. Because it's the only drawback in my mind to a microservices architecture is to do something useful, you often have to make 9 or 10 or 15 calls into that API. And so at the higher level, we can build interfaces that take care of most of that for you and that coordinate those API calls in a coherent fashion. The first one of these, which if I go by what happened in the chat channel yesterday, should no longer be called NS Console. It should be called, what is it, Console Face was one of the winners, I think. That's going to be a central landing page and sort of a convenient starting access point eventually to all of our network service offerings that we're starting to prototype and develop now. At this layer now, you're seeing a different kind of technology and a different kind of interaction. So NS Console, for instance, is implemented as a single page web application. So it's essentially static HTML and JavaScript and style sheeting that we just push out to a content delivery network. You point your browser at it, it downloads, and then the application that you just downloaded into your browser starts making those API calls in the back end to build the interface and show you interesting things and let you do interesting stuff. Again, this tends to be locally developed software. The NS console, again, is HTML, CSS, JavaScript. We're using a particular JavaScript framework called Vue. And here we're getting to the point where you're starting to see actually very rapid component evolution, right? It's very easy to change the look and feel and activity of NS console. Because it's kind of floating so high above the specifics, you actually get some flexibility in what you can do with it. And adding new tools that use that API layer is also a fairly easy thing to do. So I call this level of access abstracted access or configuration as exploration, because that's the other thing that a well-designed web UI should allow you to do is management becomes more about browsing and discovery and exploration of your resources rather than sort of knowing ahead of time what you need to do and issuing the right API calls to do it. Extension points here, again, is just any tool that we develop that relies on those API calls at the lower layer would count as an extension point. So we have NS console, and I'll show you some screenshots in just a sec. We've just started talking about some things that are more out in the future. So for instance, we could produce a client library, so a Python library that gives you an easy way to make all of those API calls so that you could then develop your own Python-based tooling or automation that's calling into our API layer and doing interesting things with our services. Similarly, if you've used any kind of common configuration management platform like Ansible, Terraform is a very popular one now. Most of those platforms have a plugin structure so that you can write, Terraform calls them providers, which are essentially libraries that then let you use that configuration management tool, Ansible or Terraform, to run API calls against an API framework like the one we're building. So if you look at sort of screenshots of what this might look like at this highest level, there's a couple of mock-ups there on the left and at the bottom of early prototypes of the NS console. That one at top left is just showing a looking glass query that's being run against one of the routers. The one down toward the bottom is I will say it's a very rough mock-up of what it would look like managing prefix sets through the NS console, which is one of the functionalities you want to start to develop early in 2022. And then at the right, my completely made up example, right? So if there might be a day when you are already using a tool like Terraform to build out your AWS infrastructure as code, and you would just add in an Internet 2 provider to your Terraform stack that would then let you also deploy Internet 2 services and resources as just the same way you would deploy an AWS resource. This whole architecture, in turn, if we pull out a little further, is surrounded by some external integration points, external integrations with useful services. So there are a number of systems and services that aren't really part of Arroyo, but that provide really useful functionality or that we could use for data augmentation for that core infrastructure and architecture. So for instance, we're already looking at business services. We could integrate with external business services to provide organizational or contractual or billing information through the console. Here at Internet 2, a couple of the ones we use are Salesforce and Link Squares. So I sort of have a bookmark in my head that we're going to need to learn what those APIs look like and how we can integrate with them, either directly or through like a data warehouse construct. Document service, as part of the early kind of user studies and focus groups, we came to the realization that, and it's not a stunning realization, documentation is never great. Service documentation is always out of date. It's tough to keep up with it. And we had this idea that, well, we should have a documentation service, I'll call it a knowledge base maybe, where we centrally manage all of the documentation for everything that all the interfaces and tools and APIs that we're developing under Arroyo. And that is really kind of external to Arroyo and queryable in Arroyo. So if, for instance, if you're in the console, you would have a documentation search bar that you can search that will provide you hits and give you links straight into relevant documentation. The tool tips that are in the console when you hover over items would probably come out of this service, out of calls into this documentation service. And just right now for that, we're prototyping it with Sphinx, which is a fairly common, what I would call it, a markup language, a documentation language in the Python community. And a really interesting tool called Dataset that lets you essentially build indexes to static content so that you can deploy all of your documentation as very, what I would consider very boring, uninteresting static content, and then have a live index that you can use to search it and query it and pull back results from it. Similarly, in common federated IAM, I've mentioned that already. At the API level, through that sessions microservice, we're tying into in common because we want to make all of the credential management, all of the attribution management. We want to externalize that. I don't want to have that living inside the core architecture. Basically, the core architecture just needs to know how to kick you over to in common, where you do your authentication. And then when you come back, we learn facts about you, and we use those facts to make decisions about access control and sort of what you can do and what we show you in the interface. So for that, that's the usual toolkit that the trust and identity folks have been working on. So co-manage, Shibboleth Grouper on the back end. Another external integration, logging analysis and reporting. Ideally, this entire architecture, and particularly with a microservices architecture, it's nice if you get all your log aggregation and sort of audit logging and event logging centralized, because then it's easier to track sort of individual events as they move through this microservices architecture. So we're working on that as well, defining a central aggregation point that's outside of Arroyo that catches all of the event and audit data. We have a Splunk instance. I think we have two. We have an old one and we have a new one. That we're sort of beginning to work with and see if that's the appropriate thing. I will say some of the presentations I saw yesterday make me think we might want to try some other directions. There might be some other opportunities there, but Splunk's good enough for prototyping for right now, for sure. Wow, I ran through that content very quickly, and that was a lot of content. We have plenty of time for Q&A. If any of that triggered any questions. And I should say, I always say at the end, that's my contact information, that's my email, that's my handle on our Slack instance, the Internet 2 Slack instance. If you have any questions or any thoughts that come up anytime in the future, please get in touch. I'd love to talk about this stuff. Always happy to answer questions about it.
Thanks, Mike. So if anyone has a question, you can throw it in Slack, or I guess we have time, so you can unmute yourself and say something as well.
Looks like it got confirmed that that is in fact TL1.
It is.
Nobody has happy feelings about it.
Oh, I don't see. I have warm fuzzies because the only time I ever did it was in support of supercomputing, so it was actually sort of a fun time for me. So it's not so bad. It was a pain. All right, well, I've got one while people are waiting. So you had a bunch of stuff there. The one thing I didn't see was sort of how OESS plugs in today and where you think it might be going. You have anything to say on that?
Yeah, so I will say in the mock-ups that we've done so far of the console, there is an OESS link and you click on it and you go to OESS, right? So that's kind of the very most basic integration is you've got a landing page and you've got convenience links on that landing page to take you to the existing tools wherever they are. I think as we get up above that, one of the, I'll call it a side effect, but it's a little bit, it wasn't really a side effect, but I'll call it that. One of the side effects of NGI was taking all of the sort of structured data that used to live specifically in OESS, and a lot of that has now moved over into NSO, right? So when you use OESS today, when you used it 6 months ago, you were talking to an internal database and internal data structures that were maintained in OESS for all those circuits. Now, when you talk to OESS, you're now talking to NSO on the back end, right? OESS is translating everything through NSO. The thing that now makes possible is, okay, we now have all that structured data in NSO. OESS becomes one means of accessing it, but we can build other tools that can interact with NSO directly. We will undoubtedly have sort of parts of the API layer that are related to cloud provisioning and management. And those calls will talk to NSO. They'll basically be, they'll talk to NSO in the same way that OESS talks to NSO. And I think the goal there for 2022, because those are that's the second big piece that's on the roadmap for 2022 is the cloud stuff, is I don't just want to reinvent OESS. I want to look at the very specific functions that are being accomplished through OESS, see if those functions are all still valid, see if they need to evolve into something slightly different, see if there are particular pieces of functionality that are missing or that don't work great or that people would like to work differently. And so some of the folks on this call may have already been in touch with our UI UX contractor, Christopher Green. He's always happy and is in the process of doing a lot of user research and focus grouping to try and again, dig out some of these details of how does the current service work? How does it not work? What should the next thing look like? What should it be?
There are a couple of things in the chats. Mike, I don't know if you want to read them or if you'd like me to. The first one, though, is George asking about how do folks feel about the IAM requirement? And I actually don't know that you said anything about a requirement. You mentioned IAM, but you didn't say anything about a requirement. So could you say a little bit about what that is? And then maybe we could see if people have a reaction to it.
Yeah, sure. So in terms of IAM, right, I think we're coming down to ideally, right, every one of those API calls would require what's called a bearer token. So a little piece of cryptographic data that says who you are and what roles you play at what organizations. And if you don't have that bearer token, that API call should just terminate right away. That would be ideal. But you're right, that then means that to make any use of this new architecture, you have to be able to have a bearer token. And that means you have to be in common in some way, some fashion. I think pragmatically, as we've started to do some prototypes, we're coming down to, there's probably 3 levels of authorization for the API and also for the console that's floating on top of the API, where the kind of most functional level is, again, full authentication through in common. So you've done your SSO, we know who you are and what your roles are, and we can make very fine-grained decisions about what you're allowed to see and what you're allowed to do. There's a lower level than that, where maybe you've done an authentication, but we haven't learned much of anything about you because we just don't have those data structures yet. And you can see, we can still show you things and still give you access to pieces of the toolkit, but it'll be at a lower level. It won't be everything. It will be a subset of everything. And then there's also, particularly when we started looking at the looking glass, the router proxy functionality, we realized that, well, there are certain things, certain commands that we just want to offer that anybody should be able to run without having to go even through an authentication process. So we do have this idea that there will be some kind of baseline functionality that does not require you to authenticate. You can imagine it'll be pretty limited. Again, it's a access versus security kind of equation where we want to make sure that, any of the dangerous stuff is well protected. And the stuff that is trivial and everyday and commonplace, we can let that show through without a full authentication. So just to say that it's not as clean cut as yes, you must be in common to use any of this stuff. It's not going to be that.
So I don't know if does anyone in the audience have any issue with that or are worried about having to authenticate within common or something else to access some of these services?
I don't think it's a problem. I think what we talked about yesterday a little bit with George and Boff at the end, but the idea of there's really 2 different scenarios. There's the scenario where your I2 is direct connected to the research institution that is going to put up and want to analyze some particular service. And then there's the hierarchical view where, you guys are connected to somebody like a REN, like us, and then we're connected to that institution. And so you have the multi-level, MS, or managed service provider type model. And you have to realize that sometimes it's a combination, both at the authentication level and the visibility level. It's a combination of services that are provided by I2 and services that are provided by the REN. And so now, for example, we have a portal. And so we would like to take pieces of the architecture and tools that are in the architecture and combine them into our portal, right? And so, we had a walk before you run kind of approach relative to IAM, which I think had general agreement, which said, you're going to get pretty far when you can just have the RENs do all the work, to get into, have their engineers get into the in-common side of things and make sure that we can do things, and then leave the REN members at read-only for a little while, and then move to full implementation where the REN can actually authorize, our members to do things by them being in common and so forth. Because obviously we have a lot, we have a lot of members, and they're not all, some of them don't know, can't spell in common, right? And my last piece is, I'm very, very interested in applying this. There's obviously the research use case, and I know we talk a lot about the research use case, but we should very much consider the implications of Cloud Connect. Cloud Connect in the REN community is exploding. You guys have put in an unbelievable utility for us at the REN level to utilize cloud services. And so the idea of moving towards automation, visibility, and analytics after the fact of cloud services is critical. And there's nobody in the business that's going to be able to do it the way that we do it. So it's a very, I almost want to take that, Cloud Connect service as a separate entity and just see what the use case looks like all the way through the REN to our different institutions. Because some of them are not education, right? Some of them are government, or whatever, right? So there's lots of different cloud use cases for us.
Just to add a little bit to that from the conversation yesterday, we also, it's not just as simple as IAM, it's also IAM at what level of assurance. And we're going to want the level of assurance where we have MFA and things like that, not just a simple password IAM. And so there'll need to be some sort of IAM onboarding process for that to make sure you have the right assurance levels and all that kind of stuff.
That's right, because right now we would be going backwards if we took away MFA. And we're not going to do that, right?
And then one of the things we talked about, like for Minnesota, I have IAM people that at the university that are capable of doing all of this stuff, but I have to get their time. And so an option for us to say, rather than us do it for the Gigapop and for our Gigapop customers, if there was a internet to feed for fee option, that would be okay too, or third party fee option, because then I can at least to my leadership say, hey, we need to do this, or we need to pay for this. You decide which one we're going to do. But if it's we need to do this, and oh well, if you push hard enough, we don't have to, then guess what? We're not going to do it.
Thanks. I don't know, Mike, is there anything else you want to add, or maybe we should go on to one of the other questions?
I'll just say quickly, network services is for this piece specifically, for the IAM piece, network services is not doing this alone. We've already been in, we're getting into closer coordination with the Trust and Identity Division, who have been dealing with these issues and know this stuff backwards and forwards. And so we're starting, we've been engaged with them already, and we're getting more deeply engaged as we try to, again, figure out that issue of, yeah, it would be nice if more regionals were more comfortable with things like InCommon and Shibboleth and technologies like that. The good news, sort of from the trust and identity side is, and I think, David, this hopefully speaks to what you were saying. It's not like it was 10 years ago where you had to roll all this stuff yourself. That there is good third-party support for a lot of these technology stacks now, and it's quite possible to, for a modest fee, kind of outsource that piece of the operation. It's not trivial by any means, but I was doing SHIB 10, 12 years ago for University of Wisconsin, and it was non-trivial back then.
Yeah, no, and it's definitely gotten easier, but I still, if I'm contracting with a third party, I still need to find the third party, and I need to have a contract and all those kind of things. And so if Internet 2 can lay that groundwork a little bit at least, then that's helpful too.
Well, this is exactly the conversation we plan to start having in beginning of 22 with the community about how we're going to approach this. Yep.
So I did want to try and get to some of the other questions. Let me just
one last quickie on that.
Go ahead, David.
It would be really nice if Internet 2 pushed to your IAM side to push this down through the in common side, that, hey, this issue is coming up for the network side of things, so that when I come talking to them, they've heard about it already and can go, oh yeah, we heard about that.
Yeah, that's happening. That's
as we speak. So let's see. Rob asked, can you share a little about the working groups and input channels, and also what the development team approach looks like? So we have a number of sort of existing structures that we've been relying on. So there's the Cloud Connect advisory group that George and Linda set up. We've been working with them. There's the software and automation subcommittee of the NAO PPAGs. We've been working with them. And in addition, sort of as we get to specific functionalities, so, right now, we're starting to look at the peering functionality. The name I mentioned before, Christopher Green, our UI UX contractor, is in the middle of putting together some specific names to do some user studies with. And I think the key there is for a particular functionality, we want to make sure we have good representation across the different types of users who would be most interested in that functionality. So for some of the earlier stuff we were doing 6 months ago, it was really kind of internal facing, network engineer facing. Now we're starting to engage more with sort of what the regional needs are going to be, and not later, like right now, starting now, I think we want to push out and start to talk about some of the other types of users. We've talked a lot recently about cloud architects at the campus level, and what can we do to provide tools and interfaces that are going to meet cloud architects' needs and sort of meet them where they live and with the technologies that they like to use. Let's see. Mark Tinberg says, how many FTE do you have working on this? Yeah, so there's me, there's Carl. There's James Haar. So we have about 3 FTE in the core team. And then we have several contracted resources. So we about 3 FTE of contract labor that we're in the process. We have 2 of those 3 on board, and hopefully the 3rd one soon. And that's kind of going to be the core group that works on this. I think that the intention there is to use the contract side for a lot of the what would I call it, the more front end work, so more of the website, and we'll probably do a little bit more of the API stuff internal on the core permanent staff team. And I should say, we have a lot of different projects coming up in 2022. Arroyo is sort of about a third to 50% of all the things that my team will be looking at in 2022. So there's some additional staffing as well that we're looking at expanding into. So I think that the short answer is that we're very small, but we're growing. And I think we'll have enough to do some really interesting stuff. If anybody out there in the community wants to volunteer FTE, I'm not averse to talking about that. Let's see. Another thing to consider, Brian, account lifecycle management. That's a good point. And I think we've talked about that a little bit already. Will there be REST API access to the new platform? Absolutely. And I see Carl answered that. Yeah, the whole point is those API endpoints should be available to anyone to use as endpoints to build your own tooling on top of. And we will have published API specifications, and we're going to pay attention to that so we don't accidentally break your tools without giving you some of a heads up. But yeah, the whole idea is, NS Console is our offering and we will maintain it. But the same kinds of things you can do with something like if you're an AWS person, if you use AWS CLI, so you can make all of the calls into AWS and deploy resources and things using command line clients or through a Python library. we want to provide that access to. And sort of the unifying function there is that kind of access control bearer token. The first thing you'll do is you will do some kind of a login. And it gets a little more complicated when we're not in a web context, but you'll do some kind of a login that will give you some kind of cryptographic token that tells us who you are. And then again, that will control what you can see and do through the API. Let's see. Will the IAM piece support OIDC or OAuth? I don't know. That's the honest answer. I don't know yet. Let's see. Oh yeah, and then Carl talked about Terraform. Yeah, I don't want to overemphasize that. Terraform is something I know I'm interested in, so I have to admit my bias there. But you know, when we get a few months down the road, if we hear from the membership that yes, we are all starting to use Terraform for all sorts of interesting things, that'll be our cue to focus some development resources on that and say, okay, that having a Terraform provider that links you into the NS API is something that we want to move up in the schedule and get that deployed sooner rather than later. If somebody says it's Ansible or Puppet or you know, pick your framework, we'll focus on that instead. I think that's everything I see in the chat.
Okay. Anyone else have anything else they want to bring up? I think that the right thing to do is, and other people can feel free to contradict me, is to let's stop here, have a longer break. Mike will probably still be around if you want to ask questions. The chat meet me rooms or whatever are available as well, I think, during the break period, if people want to get together and chat. And we will start promptly at 1:25 with the actually implementation of automation talks. Sound good? Okay, you guys have got to run the robots now, like over and over again. See you at 1:25.
That was a great job, Mike.
It was great talk.
Thank you very much. It's funny, I'm so close to this stuff, I can't tell what's obvious and what's not anymore.
No, I really, you know, I've seen you give it a few times before. I really feel like you kind of slowed down a little bit and you really kind of walked folks through it. I learned something every time, but you know, I thought the interaction was great, I thought.
Well, and I think that's kind of part of our development process. And again, my history influences this. My dad was a film and television professor, so I grew up doing film and television. When we're developing these things, whether it's an architecture or a particular piece of code or something, to me, it always feels like, you know, a lens that is out of focus, and then sort of iteration by iteration, you're slowly focusing in and getting more concrete. I try to let things be very fuzzy early on because you're sort of in that exploratory R&D mode. And then as we're finally, I think now this month, like I felt like I could put those slides together and have good, clear specifics about this is what we're doing at each of the levels. This is what it's going to look like. Where 6 months ago, we were still trying a lot of different things very quickly. And now that's settling out and we can get down to the real work of actually driving this stuff out.
I like the way you've done this before. You've set the layers up, you kind of layer things out, but I really like the slide. We also included the external features, which we're starting to talk more about than we did even 6 months ago. It really, for me, it really kind of pulled the picture together. Like, you know, this is the Arroyo, you know, architecture and infrastructure, and these outside influencers have to be a piece of it. They don't have to be embedded in it, but they're going to be a piece of the solution as well.
Yep. Well, and I think it's, you know, again, career history. I did ERP implementations for University of Arizona 10 years ago. So financials, research admin, stuff like that. And it was the same thing where, you know, from the point of view of any one ERP, you have all the other ERPs that are the sources of truth for different kinds of information. And it's all kind of figuring out how those integrate together in a way that is maintainable and sane. And it always, for us, it always came down to, okay, who owns the org charts? Because everybody has their own version of the org chart in their separate ERP.
I really like the idea that you're not going with the Highlander model. There can be only one. Because that's insane. The idea that there's only one source of truth just drives me nuts. Because that's not the way the world works.
I thought you were the only source of truth, David.
No.
Yeah, for me, it's less about who's the source of truth, and it's more about the flow of truth through the system. You know, that there's sort of an anti-pattern there where you wind up with a system that is upstream of itself if you you know, trace the things back, and then you are into all sorts of weird loop topologies and strange stuff can happen. And so we're going to try to avoid that as much as possible. And it will mean, again, like we had to do with those ERP systems years ago, we will have to, Internet 2 needs to decide this piece of information, the canon copy of it is maintained by this system. And we all agree to that. And we're all going to treat it that way. I think that, again, the other divisions of Internet 2, there's a big, they're not called data warehouses anymore. I don't think they're called data lakes. There's a new term, but it's basically pull all your data into one big pool, and then
they come up with new terms for that every half a dozen years. Yeah, and it's time for a new one, I know.
Well, and so that's one of those questions is, you know, when we do an integration, and I say this as an open question, we haven't even thought about this yet, you know, do I want to integrate directly with Salesforce, or do I want to integrate with some extract from Salesforce that's living in a data warehouse? What's the cleaner integration? What's the more maintainable integration there? And there's good reasons to go in either direction, I think. Again, we need to have a lot of skull sessions with the trust and identity folks to kind of figure out where we want to go with those.
Well, yeah, and like one of the things I know enough about the trust and identity stuff to be extremely dangerous, and that's about it. So you don't want me actually doing that stuff. I know enough to talk about it, but that's about it.
Yeah, I mean, it's been wonderful. I'll say this part of Tech Extras has been very network services focused, but it's been great having the trust and identity division to work with, and my colleagues over there are doing amazing work.
And like I said, if you can get them to start pushing it down to our campus level folks so they know this is coming, and so when I start yelling at them about it, it's not the first they've heard of it.
Yep. Yeah, well, and I think that's sort of, and George maybe can speak more on this than I can, but one of the things, like over the past few months, again, we've been very busy with NGI, but we've been trying to do this other stuff as well in the background. We've had a number of conversations with TNI sort of exactly in that line, like, okay, what kind of an on-ramp can we build, and what kind of a sort of a graduated, you don't have to go from 0 to 100 all in one step. How can we get you from where you are to where it would be good for you to be in a couple of years? Mm-hmm. Okay, wait. So Brian Miller said, get out of here with that logic, Mike. Brian, you got to tell me what that means if you're still here.
I am indeed still here. Oh, he said something about, you know, we all have to agree on it, get on the same page. This is the source of truth. That's funny, Mike. You get it. It's like let's get a naming scheme for something.
Of all the academic disciplines that I considered being relevant to our work, I never considered philosophy one until now.
Hey,
philosophy is relevant to everything.
Thank you. Yes.
Nothing.
Communications major. So
if anybody's
relevant to everything too.
If you've ever spent much time in the IPv6 working group, you would understand that Alan was just gaslighting us right there.
Oh, so there's a great, unrelated to everything else question that Carl and I were actually talking about the other day with all of this was, we had a moment where we were like, all of this should be IPv6 like native, like at the beginning.
Well, and the easy answer to that is make sure that you're using APIs that are agnostic.
Mm-hmm.
So pick the right APIs and you shouldn't have too much trouble.
Yeah.
But but yes, you need to make sure you pick that right. Because one of these days IPv4 is going to fall off the cliff. And
As the question is, can that be put off until after my retirement, though? Buy me 10 years?
I can't
Probably.
guarantee you that it can, and I can't guarantee you that it can't. In fact, my hope was that I wouldn't have to deal with IRUs again in my career, and unfortunately, I didn't get. I'm not quite ready for even thinking about retirement yet, and it's time to start thinking about renewing IRUs, and so. I'm not relishing that thought of having to
Retirement or renewing the IRUs? Which one?
spending hours upon hours upon hours in a room with lawyers. That's
Oh,
the
it's not
upside.
that bad. You get used to it, Dave.
Oh yeah, I'm used to dealing with the lawyers. It's just when we did the IRU stuff, we did a couple of day-long sessions with the lawyers, and the most interesting interaction of that was we had this meeting. We had the lawyers, the technical people, the CIOs, the purchasing people, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, all in this giant room from 4 institutions. And the lawyers had laptops, the technical people had laptops, the purchasing people didn't. And they felt a little naked. And the CIOs promised the purchasing folks that they'd get them laptops if they could just get this fixed and working. I'm not sure it ever happened, and I'm not sure that that's actually what fixed it, but it's still a good story.
Bribery is awesome.
But it was definitely, everybody in the room had laptops except for the purchasing people.
Which just means everybody else in the room found a way around purchasing to get their laptops.
Well, we won't mention who had the nicest laptops in the room. And it wasn't the CIOs.
I'm gonna bet the tech staff.
Sounds like it's time to roll into break.